By now, you know I love my wife, but Mandy and I, like every single couple that has ever existed, currently exists, or will ever exist, have on occasion come across some disagreements in our marriage. It's inevitable, don't you think, isn't it? I mean, just kind of, if you're going to live with somebody for a long period of time, you're going to have those disagreements. I mean, Cindy, if you've kept a list of all the disagreements you and Alan have had, I'm sure at this point in time it'd be really long. But anyway, usually Mandy and I are really quick to resolve our arguments. We like to live in a peaceful household. We don't like to have tension between us in any way, shape, or form. But occasionally, and I mean rarely, we have disagreements that are so big and so dramatic that it lasts for a little while. A few days in some instances. But here's the thing about Mandy and I's disagreements, is that you know this about me. I've shared this with you on more than one occasion. I am the kind of person who is so stubborn that if I believe I'm right, there is no chance of you possibly convincing me I'm wrong. You will need charts and graphs and citing all your sources available to prove to me that I am wrong before I will ever entertain the concept that I could possibly be wrong. We refer to this as the Bogue stubborn gene, because while I have it, every member of my family has it as well. It makes family disagreements really fun. But Mandy can also be a little stubborn herself. I'm sorry. She didn't throw anything, so we're good. Okay, we can keep going. Typically Mandy is a fairly passive individual. If it's something that she doesn't care that much about, she's not going to invest too much brain power onto it. But if it's something that she genuinely feels strongly about, and Mandy believes herself to be right, then she's going to stand up for herself, and she's going to do so, I'm going to use the word aggressively. My problem as her husband, she's always right. Is she looking at me? Okay, cool. The problem that comes with our marriage, though, is that the things that she and I tend to argue about are a little, well, to be perfectly honest with you, some of the things that we had our biggest disagreements about are just plain dumb. They're dumb. They're dumb. I mean, we've argued about the typical stuff that every couple does. We've argued about money and how to raise our children and all that good stuff. But then we get these really, let's call them passionate discussions over things that absolutely nobody in the entire world should care nearly as much about. And I don't think that I can give you a better example than the first disagreement that ever took place in our relationship. Let me kind of set the stage here. Mandy and I had not been dating for very long, just a couple of months. I mean, I don't even think it was that long, to be honest with you. Maybe just a few weeks even. And I don't remember how we got to this point, but we were just kind of wandering down the aisles of a Target, holding hands and being young and in love and making everybody within a 10-foot radius of us nauseous, and all the things that young love tends to do. And I don't remember how the conversation got on this point, but at some point in time, it may have been we were crossing the toy aisle and we happened to see a toy, but we got on the discussion of the television program Shining Time Station, which, if you don't know what Shining Time Station was, it was a television program on PBS when Mandy and I were children. Like I said, this argument is going to get dumb. You're going to have to stick with me. In the program, there was one human being who was kind of like our pathway into this world. If you don't know what Shining Time Station was, it was the program that gave the world Thomas the Tank Engine. Okay? I'm sure you've seen Thomas the Tank Engine. It was huge. Still might be, I don't know. But anyway, in this particular program, there was one human being, Mr. Conductor, who was the host of this particular program. And we were on the subject of it, and I don't remember what it was, but Mandy seemed to believe that the conductor of Shining Time Station was comedian George Carlin. I, however, am something of a small expert on all things Beatles, and I knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that no, Mr. Conductor was played by none other than Ringo Starr himself. I believed I was right. Mandy believed she was right. And we had an argument over who played Mr. Conductor on Shining Time Station, which was a program that by the time it hit airwaves for us in America both of us were a little too old to care about, but we both had younger siblings who watched it all the time. The disagreement ended up being so heated that we were no longer holding hands, and our date that evening ended prematurely. I took her home, and I drove back to my apartment fuming. We're talking fuming, red in the face, angry, because I believed that Ringo Starr was Mr. Conductor. We didn't have smartphones at this point in time, so we couldn't just whip out our phones and Google it real quick to prove who was right. And had we have done so, it would have saved me hours that I wasted being mad at her. Because at this point in time, I was giving serious consideration to walking away from this relationship with this amazing, beautiful, smart, wonderful, please tell me she's still looking at me, woman that I absolutely love. After a couple of hours, and I finally got a chance to calm down, I did what I should have done when I first got home in the first place, and that was I went to my laptop, I opened up Google, and I typed in Shining Time Station, Mr. Conductor, actor. And immediately, I felt like this big. Because as it turns out, we were both right. Ringo Starr had played Mr. Conductor in season 1 of Shining Time Station. George Carlin took over for seasons 2 and 3. I felt about this big, and suddenly in that particular moment, it was all revealed to me just how stupid this whole thing really, really was. I called Mandy immediately, asked her if she'd had a chance to Google it yet. She said, "No, I'm still too mad at you." And I said, "Well, you can stop being mad because as it turns out, we were both right." And then we quickly made a resolution. We agreed to see each other the next day, and we swore we would never talk about it again, especially in a group full of people. Oops. I'd like to tell you that that's the last time my wife and I ever disagreed on anything. But I think all of us in this room, we know that that's just simply not possible because conflict is a natural part of everyday life, is it not? Every single one of us, no matter how old we are, we face conflict at some point in time with other people around us. It's inevitable. I'm of the firm opinion that if there were only 2 people on earth and that was it, they'd still find things that they disagreed on. They'd still have arguments. They'd still have times that they make each other mad. If you're going to live in proximity with anybody for any significant length of time in your life, you will find things to argue about. Because we are all different people. We are made up of different preferences. We are made up of different opinions. We are made up of different beliefs. And sometimes those differences about ourselves create conflict in our lives. Nobody likes conflict. Well, I can't say that. Some people like conflict. Most of the rest of us, we try to avoid it as much as we possibly can. Right? Some people will cause conflict just to pass the time because they're bored. The rest of us, normal people, we do everything that we can to avoid conflict where we can in our lives because we want to live in that peace, harmony, and just live in this moment where we can all just get along and hold hands and sing Kumbaya. And yet we face conflict all over the place. It's such a huge part of the human experience. We face man versus man, woman versus man, woman versus woman, man versus machine, man versus job, man versus boss, man versus himself. We are so well-versed in conflict that we will create conflict with ourselves. How messed up are human beings? And yet we have to face this at every point in time in our lives. We seemingly change our approach to conflict no matter what it is. Either we get to the point where we dig in our heels and we're ready to fight until the other person changes their opinion, or we run away from it, hoping that it'll go away, hoping that somehow the magical, mystical sense of all this whole thing will just resolve itself and that we can get past that. But there is always an underlying commonality when we face conflict, especially conflict with other people, something that we need to talk about, and that is any conflict that we've ever been in, both sides of that conflict believe that they're right. Am I wrong? Every person you've ever had a disagreement with, every person you've ever had an argument with, every person that you have screamed at, they believed that they were right. Just as much as you believed that you were right. And if we're not willing to find some sort of common ground and be willing to be humble enough to say, you know what, maybe I could be wrong here, the conflict itself continues to grow. It creates tension, it creates unease, and it creates destruction in our lives. This type of conflict has come to the point where families have been completely and utterly destroyed by it. Friendships have ended because of unresolved conflict. Marriages have dissolved because of unresolved conflict. There has to be a resolution when there's conflict. And because of this, because we recognize that there needs to be some resolution in our lives whenever we face conflict, because of this fact, we have finally reached the first one of Jesus' Beatitudes, where at the very least on the surface it seems like we can agree with him. Because Jesus tells us, blessed are the peacemakers. Now again, on the surface of this particular beatitude, we can look at this and say, oh good, finally Jesus says something that doesn't immediately stir up some sort of animosity in me. It's finally something that I can wholeheartedly agree with because yes, I want to live in peace. I want to be around people who create peace. But if we just scratch that surface of being a peacemaker, well, then we learn that peacemaking is one of the hardest things that we could ever endeavor to be. The reality is that making peace with one another in the midst of conflict can be the hardest thing we do. In order to be a peacemaker, it means that we have to be willing to confront conflict head on and deal with it. And like I said earlier, we tend to react in conflict in one of two ways. Either we dig in our heels and expect and even demand that the other person concede to our way of thinking, which tends to only make the conflict worse, or we ignore it, hoping it'll go away, which all that does is bottle up the emotions that we feel and create a slow simmer until one day it begins to boil over. So our two default settings on how to create peace in our lives when we face conflict serve to only make conflict worse. How awesome are we? We're so good at this. To be peacemakers, we have to be willing to confront conflict head on, and we have to do so in maybe our least favorite word, humbly. Ugh. I'd rather confront conflict by getting right up in your face and say, I'm right, here's all the reasons why. I don't want to approach conflict humbly. I'm guessing you probably don't want to approach conflict in your life humbly either. It's not an easy task for us to accomplish this. But here we are. Jesus has said something that is so much easier said than done. He's made a point of doing this. We are on week 7 of these Beatitudes, which means that we've now talked about 7 different Beatitudes. And each one of them that we've talked about has been something that's very difficult for us to wrap our minds and our hearts around. And I want to remind you of the broader context of all of this, that these Beatitudes are simply the beginning of a much larger sermon that we have spent 7 weeks just unpacking the introduction. Yikes. Which is why we're going to spend the next 3 years going through and I'm just kidding. I don't even know how you would begin to formulate 3 years on one topic. But anyway, moving on. Is everybody awake? Okay, cool. But here's the thing. Jesus calls us as his followers, because as he's reciting this, he's telling this to his followers, those who've come beside him, those who have chosen to follow after him. He's telling us that we need to become peacemakers. He's calling us to that end. That means that Jesus not only cares about us, we talk about that a lot, how much Jesus and God love us, but that also means that Jesus cares about our relationships. He cares about the people that are around us, to the point that he knows that if we're going to face conflict with people that we genuinely care about, we need to find some way to create peace in the midst of that. I believe that reveals a huge heart about Jesus. Because here's the thing, if we don't resolve conflict, if we choose to just not become peacemakers and let the conflict continue to build, then we are either A, going to live a very lonely existence, because at a certain point everybody in our lives is going to say, I don't want to be around them. Or we're going to create an existence that is filled with simply superficial surface level relationships that don't go very deep, which is also a rather lonely existence. Jesus wants us to resolve our conflicts so that we can continue to live in community. And in fact, a few chapters away from here, Jesus lays out how we are meant to handle sometimes when we face probably our most common conflict, and that is that somebody does something or says something against us. And here's what he says, Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 through 17. Jesus says, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault. Between you and him, and this is a big word here, alone. How often do we do that? I got a problem with somebody. How often do we go straight to that person and not to 5 or 6 other people? Let me tell you about what he said. Jesus says we're to go to him alone. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. But if he won't listen, take 1 or 2 others with you. Just 1 or 2 others, so that by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, every fact may be established. If he doesn't pay attention to this, tell the church. And if he doesn't pay attention even to the church, let him be like a Gentile and a tax collector to you. Jesus doesn't just give us one simple one-liner of resolving our conflicts, right? That'd be too simplistic. Jesus actually, in this passage, gives us a roadmap to creating peace within ourselves, to restoring ourselves when somebody hurts us and affects us. Understand, Jesus in no way, shape, or form is trying to downplay the pain that you feel. You have all experienced people in your life who have hurt you very deeply. And in no way is Jesus trying to say you got to move past that, or you got to blow past that, or you got to get over that. In fact, Jesus tells us to do something that when somebody hurts us and affects us, it's probably something that we would like to do anyway. He tells us to go in and confront them. That doesn't mean we do it in a hostile manner, but peaceably. We do it privately. We don't air our dirty laundry with this person out for the entire world. And if they don't listen to us then, and if they refuse to make changes, well, then we take a couple of people that we trust, that we know are going to keep this matter between them. And if they don't listen to them, then we got to bring the whole church. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if you got in an argument with somebody, you tried to make a resolution there, they wouldn't listen to you, so you brought a couple of friends, they wouldn't listen to your friends, and so you said, well, I'm going to bring my church, and then we all just showed up at your house. That'd be a fun time. But if by some measure they won't listen to the church, you're done. The relationship's over, walk away from it. This is a simple guideline that will hopefully lead to the end of conflict in our relationships and bring about the restoration of peace. But one thing that we don't consider, and again, we've talked about this just a few minutes ago, but when it comes to the notion of conflict, is the simple idea of self-examination. It's the matter of looking at ourselves, looking at our own hearts, and considering the question, could I be wrong? See, we don't like that, because I'm always right. Right? I mean, you're usually wrong. I'm always right, though. You know why we think that way? We've talked about this before. It's because we are the heroes of our own story. We think that we're amazing. Even when we don't, we still think we're amazing. Every opinion that we've ever had is the right opinion. Right? And so it's so difficult for us to even come to the idea that we could possibly be wrong. And yet, Jesus tells us that if we want to make peace with the people around us, that that's something that we have to do. He tells us in Luke chapter 6, verses 41 through 43. It's a passage you are likely familiar with. But he says, why do you look at the splinter in your brother's eye, but you don't notice the beam of wood in your own eye? I love it when Jesus gets sarcastic. Don't you? How can you say to your brother, brother, let me take out the splinter that is in your eye, when you yourself don't see the beam of wood in your own eye, you hypocrite? First take the beam of wood out of your eye. Then you'll see clearly to take out the splinter in your brother's eye. Before we can ever hope to make peace in the midst of our conflicts that we face, the first step that we have to take, or one of the very first things that we have to do in the midst of that conflict, is to take a look at ourselves. It's hard. It's a difficult thing for us to do, to look at ourselves objectively and ask ourselves the question, could I possibly be wrong? It's not something that comes easily to us. It's not something that comes naturally to us. But man, if we want to resolve conflict, if we want to become a peacemaker, we have to. Imagine how many of the conflicts around the world might be solved peaceably if we gave a moment's pause and considered the idea that we may be at fault before we confronted the conflict. If we stopped for a moment and tried to think, what are they seeing in me that I'm not seeing in myself? Is there a part of my life that I need to make changes in order so that we can resolve this conflict? It's not an easy task by any stretch of the imagination. Again, if anybody ever told you that making peace with the world around you should be simple, they lied. But it is such a necessary step for us to take. Resolving conflicts in our relationships matters to Jesus. In fact, it's so important to him that we resolve conflicts amongst ourselves. Jesus went so far as to tell us back in Matthew chapter 5, verses 23 and 24. He said, so if you are offering your gift on the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift in front of the altar. Go and be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Jesus is telling us that if our worship is to be genuine, if we genuinely want to chase after God, if we want our worship to mean something, that means that first we have to make peace with those around us. Otherwise, it could affect our worship. See, we try to think that we can compartmentalize our conflicts, don't we? We try to think that we can just press pause on the situation or the argument or the discussion or something like that, and we can go do something else. And that may be true in most areas of life, but Jesus tells us when it comes to this, when it comes to here, if somebody has a conflict with you, go resolve it first. So if anybody needs to leave, now's your chance. No, I'm just kidding. So, this is so important to the heart of Jesus, that conflicts are resolved amongst ourselves, that he even says, resolve the conflict before you come to worship God. That is huge. And yet it's something that we tend to miss so very often. The reality is that we will face conflicts in our lives always. Fun, right? The simple nature of living in a world of different people is always going to mean that there are going to be different conflicts that we have to face. The problem, hear me, the problem is not that conflict happens. The problem is we don't resolve them. Conflict, and this may be hard to hear, can be one of the things that builds us up to become our best selves. I believe that God can work in the midst of our conflicts. That God can transform our lives and through somebody else having a conflict with us. The problem is not conflicts take place. The problem is that conflicts aren't resolved. When we fail to find a resolution, or as it seems like in most common cases, we don't pursue a resolution to begin with, it creates that tension, it creates that unease, it creates this disruption, it creates a whole host of other problems that we can't even begin to describe in our lives. Conflict must be resolved. Jesus calls his followers to make peace, especially with one another, especially with each other as followers of Jesus. And if we were completely honest here, if we were willing to be completely and utterly transparent and take a really hard look at ourselves, the church has failed miserably in this. Historically, currently, the church is terrible at resolving conflicts within itself. Are we not? We face conflicts all the time, even within our brothers and sisters in Christ. Just because we all follow the same God, the same Jesus, the same Holy Spirit does not mean that we are somehow magically, mystically immune to conflict with one another. But the church should be the one setting the example of how to peaceably resolve conflict. And instead we allow things like church splits. We allow things like excommunication. We allow things like men and women coming to the pulpit and denouncing people who are in the crowd with them. Christians, this can't be the case. Jesus called us to be peacemakers. Is it hard? Absolutely. Is it complicated? You bet. Is it messy? But it's what we're meant to be. It starts when we resolve the conflicts within ourselves. Because if we can't resolve the conflicts within this building, or within buildings similar to this, is it any wonder why the world laughs at us? Calls us hypocrites. So the question naturally becomes, well, how do we make our way towards peace, right? We've talked about how we have conflict. We talked about how it's important for us to have peace. How do we get there? I'm going to give you some simple steps, some simple ideas. If you got a pen and paper, maybe you want to jot these down. Might be helpful for you later. Again, I'm sorry your sermon notes didn't get done. But here it is. First thing we got to do, pray. Always. I know. The preacher just said the first thing we got to do is pray. Yeah, that's a necessary step for us to take. Because it invites God into the conflict that we're currently facing. It invites God to begin to work in our own hearts and in our own ways, to reveal to us a peaceable method to find the end of this conflict, to teach us to love the person that we're in conflict with. Maybe even that prayer needs to be, God, help me want peace. Because maybe we don't. Second step we got to take, and again, this is the one we talked about, the one that's really, really hard. Got to look at ourselves. Oh, you don't want to. I know you don't. I don't want to either. But we got to. To ask ourselves that question wholly and honestly, could I possibly be wrong here? Because if the answer to that question is yes, I am wrong, then this no longer becomes about let's talk it out. This becomes let me apologize. We don't want to apologize in conflict. But if we skip this step, I don't think the peace really happens. We have to be willing to ask that question. And then when we are ready to approach the other person and they are ready to approach us, one of the most important things that we can do, one of the biggest reasons why we face conflicts is because we are unable or unwilling to listen. So be ready to listen before talking. To hear their side of this, to hear why they think the way that they think, to hear what their reasoning is for this so we can create a level of understanding with one another. Then it's important for us to find common ground. Find something that we both share in common with each other. If we're talking about in the church, our common ground is simply we want to find peace because that's what Jesus wants us to do. It sounds simplistic, but man, is it important. Because it's a start. Begin to discuss out what's going on, what's happening. Try to find a peaceful and appropriate resolution to this. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, be ready to forgive. And be ready to be forgiven. I don't know about you, when I face conflicts in my own life, especially the handful of times in those conflicts in my life where I have a tendency to blow up. I know it seems crazy. Brandon blows up? What? It's easy for me to be able to forgive the other person. It's a whole lot harder for me to forgive me. And yet, because of what Jesus did for us, we are forgiven. And that peacefulness comes when we have learned to forgive one another and forgiven ourselves. That last step is most difficult for us to process, but it's so important to us because let's face it, conflict hurts. It hurts. Some of you in the midst of conflict and heated discussions and arguments and screaming matches, let's be real, have said and have had things said to you that are so hurtful that they have devastated with you, and you have carried that pain possibly for years. It's hard for us to be able to forgive and to be forgiven, but the resolution of our conflict matters to Jesus. And it matters to Jesus because Jesus himself would become the peacemaker for the greatest conflict that had raged on since the garden. He made peace in the conflict between our selfishness and God's perfection, our sinfulness and God's holiness, our choices and God's grander plan for the entirety of creation. When Jesus went to the cross, when he died, he became the sacrifice that was necessary so that we could have resolution of our conflict with God and that we could be restored in that relationship with God. Our ability to make peace matters to Jesus because he made peace with the single greatest conflict in the world. And he calls us as his followers to be willing to set aside our pride and our arrogance and to become a peacemaker. He tells us, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God."